A room above a narrow street in Jerusalem, oil lamps burning low, throwing long shadows against plaster walls. The smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs still hangs in the air from the meal just finished. Somewhere outside, the city hums with the sound of a million pilgrims gathered for Passover, completely unaware that history is about to pivot in a room they will never see. 13 men reclining around a table too small for the weight of what is about to happen. One of them dips his bread into the dish. His hand does not shake. That is the part nobody ever talks about. His hand does not shake at all. Across the table, Jesus is watching him. Not with rage, not even with sadness exactly, but with something far heavier than both. The look of a man who has known for years exactly how this night would end, and chose to stay at this table anyway. And then he says it, a sentence so dark, so absolute, that 2,000 years later, scholars still pause over it, sinners still flinch at it. Even skeptics, reading it for the very first time, go completely quiet. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Read that again. This is Jesus. The same Jesus who let children climb into his lap. The same Jesus who knelt in the dirt and told a woman caught in adultery that he would not condemn her. The same Jesus who told Peter to forgive. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And he looks at one of his own 12 and says, it would have been better if that man had never existed at all. What could possibly deserve those words? And here is the question underneath the question, the one that should actually unsettle you. Was Jesus talking only about Judas and that room on that night? Or was he describing something that still applies to anyone capable of doing what Judas did? Stay with me until the end. Because by the time we get there, you are going to understand this verse in a way almost nobody preaches it. And you are going to find out that the most terrifying words Jesus ever spoke were never really a curse on a life. They were a warning. And warnings, unlike curses, can still be heeded. To understand the weight of those words, you have to forget what you think you already know about Judas Iscariot. He was not a stranger Jesus picked up off the road. He was not a background extra in someone else's story. For 3 years, Judas ate at the same fires, walked the same dust, and slept under the same stars as Peter, James, and John. He watched Jesus take a basket meant to feed one family and multiply it until 5,000 people were full. He watched a dead 12-year-old girl open her eyes at the sound of Jesus' voice. He watched a man born blind see color for the very first time in his life. And Jesus trusted him, and not just a little. Judas was the one who carried the money bag for the entire group, the treasurer of the ministry. That is not a minor detail you just skip past. That is access. That is intimacy. That is a level of trust Jesus did not hand to strangers. Which means whatever happened inside Judas did not begin at the Last Supper. It started small, a skimmed coin here, a private resentment there, a quiet, repeated decision made in rooms nobody else ever saw, to love something more than he loved the man sitting across the table from him. Here is what most people miss. Betrayal on this scale is almost never a single dramatic moment. It is 100 small surrenders long before the big one ever happens. So, that night, during Passover, the very meal that once marked Israel's deliverance out of slavery, Jesus drops a sentence into the room like a stone into still water. One of you will betray me. And here is what almost nobody slows down long enough to notice. Every single disciple at that table, every one of them, responds the same way. Not is it him, but rather, Lord, is it I? 12 men who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, 12 men who had watched him heal, feed, forgive, and raise the dead, and not one of them was confident enough in his own heart to rule himself out. Sit with that for a second, because if grown men who had watched Jesus do the impossible could still wonder if the next betrayal might be theirs, what does that say about how easily any heart can drift, including yours and including mine? That is the first warning hiding inside the story. The betrayal did not begin with an obvious villain. It began at a table full of men who loved Jesus, and one of them quietly did not anymore. Now, here is where it gets deeper. The word Jesus uses for betrayed in the original Greek is paradidomi. You would expect a word that means to stab in the back or to deceive. That is not what it means. Paradidomi means to hand over, to deliver into someone else's hands. It is the exact word the New Testament later uses to describe what God the Father did with his own Son. Paul writes that God gave him up, paradidomi, for us all. The same word, two completely different hearts behind it. Judas handed Jesus over to save himself. The Father handed Jesus over to save us. One handover was payment for 30 pieces of silver. The other was payment for sin the whole world owed and could never repay. That is not a coincidence buried in the grammar. That is the entire gospel, hiding inside a single Greek verb. But here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. 1,000 years before that dinner, King David wrote a psalm about a coming betrayal, and he was not speaking in vague riddles. Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. Shared my bread, the exact image of a hand dipping into a dish at a table. And centuries after David, the prophet Zechariah, who never met Jesus, who never met Judas, wrote down a price, 30 pieces of silver, the exact figure the religious leaders would later pay for this exact betrayal. Not a similar number, not a round estimate that happened to line up. The precise sum recorded centuries before there was a temple treasury to draw it from, or a disciple alive yet to receive it. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him." He was not being poetic. He was pointing to ink on a scroll written long before Judas was even born, and watching it unfold in real time in his own dining room on the worst night of his life, which raises the question theologians have wrestled with for 2,000 years. The same question you have probably wondered, even if you never said it out loud. If it was written, was Judas even free? Or was he just an actor forced to play a part he never auditioned for? Look at the sentence again, closely, because Jesus answers it in the very same breath most people rush past. The Son of Man goes, as it is written of him. That is the plan, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. That is the choice. Jesus holds both at once in a single sentence with no contradiction between them. God's plan moves through history like a river nothing can stop, and a man, fully free, fully responsible, chooses to step into that current and steer his own hand towards betrayal. Prophecy did not make Judas guilty. Judas's own heart made Judas guilty. The prophecy simply told us in advance that someone would do it. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because if Judas had no real choice, this is just ancient history, a sad story about a man trapped in a script he never wrote. But if Judas chose freely, slowly, deliberately, across years of small compromises, then this story stops being about him. It becomes about anyone capable of choosing the exact same thing. And that leads to a question that should bother you even more. If Jesus knew from the very beginning what Judas would eventually do, why call him at all? Why hand the money bag, the trust, the access to a man Jesus already knew would betray him? Here is what most people miss. Jesus never treated Judas any differently than the other 11. He washed Judas's feet the same night he washed Peter's. He let Judas dip his hand in the very same dish. He gave him every chance, every warning, every open door, right up until the last hour. Jesus did not choose Judas because the story needed a villain. He chose him the way he chooses every one of us, knowing exactly what we are capable of and loving us anyway, right up until the moment we decide what we are going to do with that love. The tragedy of Judas was never that Jesus did not give him enough chances. It is that Judas ran out of chances he never had to run out of, which brings us to the garden. Later that same night, under olive trees gone silver in the moonlight, Judas leads a cohort of armed men to the place he knew Jesus would be praying. Torches flicker between the trees. The clink of swords and the shuffle of sandals on stone breaks the silence of a garden that only minutes earlier had been quiet enough to hear an olive branch shift in the wind. Judas walks ahead of them, steady, unhesitating. A man who has crossed so many small lines already that this last one barely registers as a line at all. He has rehearsed this. He has a sign already prepared, the same gesture a friend gives a friend. He kisses him. Luke records Jesus' response, and it is almost too sad to read out loud. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Not a kiss withheld out of guilt, a kiss given deliberate. That is how far the small surrenders had carried him. What started with a skimmed coin ended with a kiss used as a weapon. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, because I think this is the part of the story where a lot of us quietly recognize ourselves, whether we want to admit it or not. Has there ever been something in your life that you knew deep down was pulling you away from God, and instead of turning back early, you let it grow one small compromise at a time, exactly the way Judas did? You do not have to answer out loud, but I genuinely love to hear in the comments where you have noticed that pattern in your own life, because I think more of us carry a little bit of Judas in us than we are usually willing to admit. And if this kind of deep dive into Scripture, pulling back the layers on verses everybody has read but almost nobody has really seen, is something you want more of, this channel exists for exactly that. Consider subscribing, because what we are about to look at next is the part of the story most people never hear preached. Now, let us go back to the sentence that started all of this. Woe to that man. In the Greek, the word is why, and it is not a curse handed down in a courtroom. It is closer to a cry of grief. It is the sound you make standing over a tomb, not the sentence a judge reads before an execution. Jesus is not sneering at Judas. He's grieving over him even while telling him exactly where his choice was leading. And then comes the line that makes people's blood run cold. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Here is what most people miss. The Greek word translated good, kalon, does not just mean pleasant or nice. It means fitting, whole, the way something is supposed to be. Jesus is saying that non-existence, nothing at all, would have been more fitting, more whole than the road Judas was walking to the end of without ever turning back. It is worth noticing the shade of meaning packed into that one word. The New Testament has another common word for good, agathos, used for things that are morally or inherently good. Jesus does not reach for that word here. He reaches for kalon, a word that leans towards fitting or well-suited rather than simply pleasant. That distinction matters in a sentence this heavy. He is not describing punishment for punishment's sake. He is describing a mismatch, a soul never designed to end this way, ending this way anyway. That is not a comment on Judas's worth as a human being. God does not make anyone less loved, less image-bearing, less capable of mercy than the disciple sitting 2 seats down from him. Every person at that table, Judas included, was made in the image of God and was loved by the man he was about to betray. It is a comment on what one particular choice, carried all the way to the end without ever turning back, does to a soul. Some choices do not only cost you something, they cost you everything that could have been. And we know, painfully, how the story ends for Judas. After the betrayal, after the arrest, after he saw exactly what his 30 silver coins had purchased, Scripture tells us Judas was overwhelmed with remorse. He threw the money back at the religious leaders, said the words, "I have betrayed innocent blood," and in the crushing weight of that guilt, he took his own life. I want to pause here gently, because if you have ever sat that close to your own darkness, this matters. That ending was never the only door available to him. It was the one he chose, alone, in the dark, without ever telling another living soul what he was carrying. And that single detail, alone, in the dark, telling no one, sets up the most important contrast in this entire story. What happened to that money is almost stranger than the death itself. Matthew tells us the religious leaders, unwilling to put blood money back into the temple treasury, used it to buy a field, a plot of land, to use afterward to bury the city's unclaimed dead. People started calling it Akeldama, the field of blood. You can still find the name on maps of Jerusalem today, 2,000 years later. And here is where the "it was written" thread pulls tight one more time. Matthew does not pass over this in silence. He tells us the purchase of that field fulfilled words written generations earlier by the prophet Jeremiah, pointing to a potter's field bought with silver, paid for by a man's life. The very dirt Judas's guilt money ended up in had already been written about before there was a temple standing to throw the coins into. Even the empty seat Judas left behind had already been written about. Not long after, the remaining disciples gathered to choose someone to take his place among the 12, and Peter stood up and quoted a psalm written 1,000 years earlier by David. "Let another take his position. A man falls, his seat gets filled. The mission goes on. Nothing about that night, not the betrayal, not the silver, not the field, not even the empty chair at the table, happened outside what God had already seen coming." Because here is something almost nobody puts side by side, even though the Gospels practically beg you to. That same night, another disciple also betrayed Jesus. Not to soldiers, not for silver, but with his own mouth. 3 separate times, standing beside a charcoal fire, denying he even knew the man. His name was Peter. 2 disciples, 2 betrayals. The very same night, against the very same Lord. One walked away into the dark and never came back. The other wept bitterly. And after Jesus rose from the dead, on a beach beside another charcoal fire that must have felt like deliberate, aching mercy, Jesus asked him one question 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter was restored, fully, publicly, given a mission, given a future, and given a church to build. Same failure, same shame, same night, completely different ending. Not because Peter's sin was smaller. It was not small at all. He denied Christ to his face on oath while Jesus was being beaten a few feet away. The difference was never the size of the sin. The difference was where each man ran when the guilt came looking for him. Judas ran toward death. Peter ran toward Jesus. And that right there is the part of the story that changes everything if you let it. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born, was never really a sentence about birth. It was Jesus grieving out loud over what it looks like when a soul carries its guilt all the way to the grave, instead of carrying it back to the only person who could actually lift it off. Judas had 30 pieces of silver in his hand, and a Savior sitting across the table the entire time, close enough to touch, close enough to ask. He simply never turned back towards him. Peter had nothing in his hands but failure, and he ran straight to the man he had betrayed anyway. That is the whole gospel hiding inside 2 disciples' worst nights. Maybe you are watching this and there is a version of Judas's slow drift happening in your life right now. Something small you have let grow for years, a compromise you have justified so many times it does not even feel like a compromise anymore. Or maybe you have already done the thing, said the words you cannot unsay, made the choice you would give anything to undo, and some quiet voice has been telling you that you are too far gone, that this is the part of the story where people like you do not get to come back. Maybe it is a marriage you have quietly betrayed in your heart long before anyone else ever saw it on the outside. Maybe it is a friendship you smile through while resenting every minute of it. Maybe it is a habit, an addiction, a secret life you fed in private for so long it stopped feeling like a compromise and started feeling like just who you are. Whatever it is, hear this. It did not start the size it is right now. Almost nothing does. That voice is lying to you. The very same Bible that records the most terrifying words Jesus ever spoke also tells us about a dying thief on the cross beside him. A man with nothing left to offer, nothing left to undo, no time left to fix anything. And Jesus told him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." There was room for a dying thief. There was room for a disciple who denied him 3 times to his face. There is room for you. The whole truly unforgivable ending in this story was never a particular sin. It was a refusal to turn around. So, here is what I want you to carry out of that room, above the narrow street in Jerusalem 2,000 years later. Jesus is still at the table. The bread is still being passed. And somewhere tonight, someone watching this is quietly deciding which disciple they are going to be. The one who lets the guilt carry him into the dark alone, telling no one, or the one who gets up, walks back through the door he ran out of, and lets the very Jesus who already knew exactly what he would do, still call him by name. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born, but it would be everything for you if you turned around tonight and walked back towards the fire. He is still there. He never left.